A major data-driven report from the British energy think tank Ember shows that China is creating the conditions for a global decline in fossil fuel use. According to the report, China is demonstrating that decarbonization can go hand in hand with industrial upgrading, job creation, and improved quality of life. We will discuss this extraordinary and hopeful news with Carlos Martinez later in the show. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate but know so little about. I'm your host, KJ No. These are this week's headlines. Foreign Affairs magazine urges nuclear attacks on Chinese troops. Foreign Affairs magazine, the public policy journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, recently published an article calling for a war plan to thin out Chinese troops with nuclear and conventional attacks. The article stated that the United States needs to prioritize defeating and deterring China and call for a credible plan incorporating the use of both nuclear and conventional weapons. The U.S. actually has war plans mapped out for China since 2009 called Air-Sea Battle. Based on the Soviet-era air-land battle, itself derived from Israeli war doctrine, air-land battle was used against Iraq and is commonly referred to as shock and awe. The China-focused version of shock and awe, Air-Sea Battle, was developed in 2009 under the Obama administration and was tested and used on Libya in 2011. It has undergone 9 revisions since. Top Chinese mathematicians return to China. Liu Jun, a leading Chinese statistician, has returned home to China. He follows many other top mathematicians of Chinese origin in the United States who have gone back to academic positions in Chinese universities. These include Yuan Yuan, the internationally renowned complex geometry researcher, Zhong Weishen, the expert on partial differential equations and harmonic analysis, Li Hanfeng, an expert on non-commutative geometry and dynamical systems, and Zhang Yitang, the number theorist who cracked the 500-year-old twin prime conjecture. Many Chinese academics say they are affected by the administration's persecution of Chinese scholars, as well as the massive cuts in funding for research. In contrast, China offers a supportive environment for research and scholarship, and according to Nature Index, has the majority of top academic institutions. 14 of the top 20 research institutions in the world are currently Chinese. South Korean camptown prostitutes charge the U.S. government with sex trafficking. According to Agence France-Presse, 117 South Korean women forced to work as camptown prostitutes to service U.S. troops have filed a landmark lawsuit accusing the U.S. military of state-sponsored sex trafficking abuses. In 2022, South Korean courts acknowledged that the South Korean government had established and operated brothels for the U.S. military in contravention of Korean laws. This new lawsuit seeks an apology from the U.S. government. I cannot forget being beaten by U.S. soldiers, slapped for lowering my head while pouring drinks, or for not smiling, or for no reason at all. Another plaintiff recounted that she was dragged out every night and sexually assaulted by U.S. troops. She was a minor at the time. The women were also routinely subjected to forced genital inspections and medically incarcerated if they tested positive for STDs. They were also shot up with massive amounts of antibiotics without informed consent, sometimes resulting in death. U.S. military police were often involved in identifying, detaining, and policing these women, and U.S. medics often administered the shots. The U.S. government has not responded to inquiries on this matter. Successive administrations have tried to suppress or deny this sordid history as it complicates the recruitment of South Korea into U.S. war plans against China. China unveils the world's first brain-like AI that runs 100 times faster. Chinese researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences have developed the world's first brain-like AI that runs 100 times faster while using a tiny fraction of the energy and computing resources required by conventional AI. The AI system, called Spiking Brain, is designed to operate on homegrown Chinese chips, obviating the need for US chips. Unlike transformer models of AI computation that require extraordinary amounts of energy, data, and computational power, Spiking Brain demonstrated processing speeds 26 to 100 times faster while being trained on less than 2% of the data. This new approach, spiking computation, is modeled on the activation of brain neurons, in particular using adaptive attention architectures. Researchers stated that this demonstrates proof of concept of brain-inspired neuromorphic mechanisms for the next generation of efficient and scalable AI computing systems. Chinese invent bone glue for fractures. Chinese researchers have invented a bone glue that can knit together fractures without metal plates, screws, pins, or even major surgery. The medical adhesive can be injected directly into a fracture where it bonds bone fragments together in 2 to 3 minutes. Chinese researchers were inspired by oysters who adhere to surfaces in constantly moving salt water. The bone glue is designed to work in blood-infused areas where most adhesives fail, offering a revolutionary approach to orthopedic fracture repair with minimal surgery. The glue itself is harmlessly absorbed and metabolized after it has completed its work. Prior to China's accomplishments in new energy technologies, sustainable growth was an oxymoron and ecological development was a pie-in-the-sky slogan. However, a new major data-driven report from the British energy think tank Ember shows that that's no longer the case. China's ecological civilization is leading the world away from fossil-fueled economies and showing the way out of climate catastrophe. Is this the power of socialist planning to serve the people and save the planet? Editor of Friends of Socialist China, Carlos Martinez, will join us to discuss. Welcome, Carlos.
Hi, KJ. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. An honor as always to be with you.
I wanted to jump right in and ask you, what does the Ember report say, and why is it important for us?
I mean, look, it's a very detailed and really fascinating and probably quite unprecedented report. Ultimately, at the top level, what it shows is that China is the first country in global history to have broken the link between development and the growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's quite a nice quote from the report that sums it all up. It says, through scale, innovation, and long-term planning, China is demonstrating that decarbonization can go hand in hand with industrial upgrading, job creation, and improved quality of life. So this really represents a big shift for China, right? From the late 70s till the early 2010s, GDP was growing at a massive rate, an average of nearly 10%. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty, as we know. But there was a very strong correlation as development increased, as modernization increased, and as quality of life and GDP increased, so did carbon emissions and environmental damage. What you've got now is you've got a the GDP continues to grow, the economy continues to grow, people's conditions of life continue to improve, but they've managed to stop increasing their greenhouse gas emissions along with that. And kind of they've accomplished the opposite in the sense that these new parts of the economy, the clean energy sector in particular, and the electric vehicle sector is actually contributing to a healthy economy, is contributing to jobs, is contributing to growth. So they're reducing their dependence on imported fossil fuels. They're reducing their energy costs. They're creating millions of new jobs. And this whole clean energy sector is actually growing 3 times faster than the overall economy is. So it's a huge growth area. The report details a lot of the progress that China's made in relation to renewable energy in particular. So it points out that last year, wind and solar generation increased by 25%, and the wind and solar capacity have more than doubled in the last 3 years alone. The report points out that China's responsible for about a third of all global clean energy investment, and its generation from wind and solar is now at 18% of total electricity, which maybe doesn't sound like much. It's just a fifth, right? But bearing in mind that China also has a lot of hydroelectric and China also has a lot of nuclear. So in terms of their total green or clean energy or emissions-free energy, the percentage is much higher. But also that's an 18%, which is growing fast, because just 5 years ago, it was 9%. And just 5 years before that, it was 4%. So the current trajectory and the trajectory for the last 10, 15 years has been doubling every 5 years. So on that basis, we might expect that by the time it gets to 2030, it would be at 36%, etc. In addition to all that, there have been these unprecedented innovations in like long distance transmission infrastructure. In the west and the center of the country, places like Xinjiang, places like Shanghai, places like in Mongolia, that's where there's a huge amount of space, including huge amounts of desert. It's a perfect area to capture solar power, perfect area to capture wind power, but it's not where there's very high population density. So the innovations in transmission are helping to transmit all this energy from the west and the center of the country to particularly the east and southern seaboard, where literally hundreds of millions of people live. And in addition to these traditional renewable energies such as wind, solar, hydroelectric, China's now home to half of the world's green hydrogen capacity, and that's super important, especially in terms of decarbonizing heavy industry. The report also highlights what China's doing in terms of electrification. I mean, it's kind of a given now in the ecological science community that if we want to prevent climate breakdown, the focus number one has got to be electrify everything. So China's share of electricity in final energy consumption is up to 32% now, which is well ahead of the US, well ahead of Western Europe, both of which are in the low 20s. And China, again, is growing very, very quickly, because at the beginning of the century, China was at 10% electrification. So they've made very impressive progress in terms of electrifying transport. And what they've done with high-speed rail and electric buses is very well known. In terms of electrifying heating and industry, of course, with cars, electric vehicles, China produces around 2/3 of the world's electric cars. They've got a charging infrastructure that connects around the whole country. There's literally millions and millions of charging points. And they're at the point now where most of the electric cars sold in China are actually cheaper to consumers than their internal combustion engine equivalents. So, if you're in China and you're buying a car, it makes economic sense for you to get an EV. It's not a question of, you're playing your role and making a gift to the environment. China's become the major innovator in clean tech. So the report notes that out of all global clean energy patents, China's responsible for 75% now, and that's up from 5% in the year 2000. And the report also points to the reason for this progress, and this is really crucial. It points out that China's had massive investment in clean energy in energy storage, in transmission grids. And the report makes it really clear as well that China's got what they call careful planning, sound policy, sustained commitment, and they use this term policy clarity. That means there's long-term targets, there's 5-year plans, there's industrial policies that are very clearly set out by the government, consistently implemented. Targets and metrics are built around those so that state-owned companies, individually owned companies, collectively owned companies, all of these can actually plan for the long term. And there's a sort of implicit contrast with what's happening in the United States, right? The report doesn't say it explicitly, but anyone who's reading it is going to think, well, that's exactly what we don't have in the West in general and in the United States in particular. So it's an extremely, extremely interesting report. And I think it's going to contribute to a shift in popular perception of where China is at in relation to the environment. Because there's still a perception, I think, that China is something of a climate criminal. China is, after all, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. China still burns lots of coal. China's still building some coal power stations and so on. There's lots of caveats and there's lots of answers to that. That one can go into. If you look at China's per capita emissions, they're actually very normal, pretty close to the global median, similar level to Czech Republic or Iceland or whatever. And they're about half those of the US, about half those of Canada or of Australia. And of course, China's still a developing country. It's still an industrializing country, and it's the workshop of the world. We in the West, we've reduced our emissions a little bit, not very much, but a little bit. But to the extent that we have done, it's not because we've innovated massively on clean energy. It's not because we've made major compromises in terms of our living standards and our quality of life. It's because we've shifted our emissions, we've exported them along with manufacturing. And again, in terms of cumulative emissions, in terms of the greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide, the methane that's in the atmosphere right now, the United States is responsible for fully 25% of that, a quarter, right? So the United States, with around 4% of the world's population, is responsible for 25% of cumulative emissions. That's 6 times its fair share, if you want to put it like that. China's responsible for 13%, but China's got 18% of the world's population. So China's responsible for, what does that make it? 70%. China's consumed 70% of its fair share. But anyway, that's a perception that I think is shifting. I think this report is going to help highlight that shift. The reality is that China's actually been a very responsible player in terms of the climate change conversation from the beginning. China was part of the discussions very early on in the 1980s, 1990s. And this notion of ecological civilization, which has really been popularized over the last few years, particularly with the Xi Jinping leadership, that's been part of the narrative in China for a long time, and is pretty consistent with traditional Chinese philosophy and Confucian ideas of harmony between man and nature and so on. So China's been a participant in these conversations, and China's certainly been concerned about the environmental problems and the possibility of passing these various environmental tipping points. But it has tended to focus very much on defending its own right to development and kind of providing a leadership role in the developing world, in the global south, that, look, our priority has got to be to develop. It can't be the case that Western Europe and North America can ruin the planet and then kind of pull the ladder up behind them and say, well, you guys don't have the right to modernize anymore. You guys don't have the right to develop anymore. So China's been very focused on pushing a narrative of common but differentiated responsibilities. But especially in the last 10 years, I would say its strategy has shifted a little bit. And that correlates with China's overall development and its overall modernization process, and the fact that it's become now a science and technology powerhouse. It's really, I think, it's past a tipping point where it can both continue to develop, it can continue to modernize, and it can play the global need that it clearly needs to play in terms of preventing climate breakdown, climate catastrophe. Aside from climate change directly, China's also a world leader on biodiversity protection, on forestation. You know, forest coverage has gone up in the last 2, 3 decades from around 12% to around 24%. So it's doubled at a time where in most of the rest of the world, forest coverage has been decreasing, right? China's making all these innovations. There was a story recently that you probably saw, you probably covered, around the space solar power station that they're hoping to launch into orbit by 2028. So, realistically, China is the only country in the world that's going to drive the green energy revolution. And I think that's what this report is helping people to understand.
Well, thank you, Carlos. And, I think once again, it's important for us to remember that, the existential crisis that the world is facing, apart from World War, is actually global climate catastrophe. And for decades, I was told, that there was really no technological fix, that there was no way out of it. The economics just didn't work. And that, we were either doomed or we actually had to deindustrialize and reduce consumption. And so this is quite striking. And I'm also very struck by the fact that, China talks about differentiated responsibilities, but that it has concretely given the global South the capacity to develop. You say that it's implicit. There's an implicit criticism of the United States, but I'm actually interested in making it more explicit. Why didn't the United States do what China did, or why couldn't it do what China did?
Sure. I mean, the United States is really going in the other direction now. But more generally, the conversation's been very clear. Like in terms of what needs to be done to prevent climate breakdown, I feel like that's been pretty well known for more than 30 years, and actually there's been an international consensus, right? And it's been written into international law what we need to do in terms of decarbonizing and following a path of clean energy. Certainly since the Rio summit, I think in 1991, 1992. So we're talking 33, 34 years ago. And we've always been told that whole time that markets are going to solve the problem. The economics of supply and demand are going to solve the problem. This is a actually existing problem that the world has got, and the free market is going to come to our rescue and is going to meet the demand that the world has got to move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And that almost hasn't happened at all. So little progress has been made on that. And in fact, there is more green energy than there used to be, but there's more overall energy. So the fact is we're burning fossil fuels as a planet at a far higher rate than we were 30 years ago. If we maintained the level of fossil fuel burning that we were at 30 years ago, we would be in a much less dangerous and a much less precarious situation than we are now. So I think what these last 30, 35 years have shown is that capitalism is essentially incapable of solving this problem. A free market economy is incapable of solving this problem. A world that is governed by the interests of profit and in the interests of a ruling class, a group of people that own and deploy capital, is incapable of making the wide-ranging and long-term decisions that are needed. And conversely, the fact that it's China that's able to do these things, that it's China that's able to put in this massive effort, these huge resources into this whole project of preventing climate breakdown and protecting the natural environment, that has to be, that's not coincidence. That has to be connected ultimately to the class nature of the capitalist, of the Chinese state, to the fact that the capitalist class isn't the ruling class, the fact that you haven't got a fossil fuel lobby in China, you haven't got oil companies and coal companies and gas companies kind of putting pressure on the government to say, no, invest in fossil fuels, subsidize fossil fuels instead of renewable energy. It has to be connected to the essentially planned nature of the Chinese economy, where even the private sector is heavily regulated and works within a framework of 5-year plans and so on. It has to be connected to the fact that the banks or the major banks are publicly owned, and therefore important investment decisions and important decisions about what technologies you pursue and what new sectors you open up are made by the state in the interests of the people rather than in the interests of profit. It has to be connected to public ownership of the energy industry and most of the transport industry. And ultimately what it comes down to is that, yes, China is a market economy, but it's a socialist market economy. And in spite of the fact that there's a large quantity of private capital in it, and the market has a major role, essentially and overall, the system aims at producing use values over exchange values. And that's really the difference. That's the fundamental reason that China's been able to emerge as the undisputed leader in this battle against climate breakdown. Meanwhile, the US, Britain, EU, Japan have made precious little progress. They say that they're trying to get to net zero by 2050. Yeah, I mean, at the current rate of progress, that is sheer fantasy. Various left-wingers in Britain, in the US, in Europe talk about a Green New Deal and all the rest of it. But again, it's a completely radical fringe demand. Nobody in their right mind thinks that that's actually going to be implemented. Meanwhile, in China, their program of ecological civilization is precisely a Green New Deal on a almost inconceivable scale. Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement for the second time. You no doubt saw his speech at the UN General Assembly, where he refers to green energy as being a scam. The administration's energy policy is drill, baby, drill. And yes, Trump is worse than Biden, but Biden wasn't very much better. Biden still prioritized sort of Cold War competition, that sort of international framework, relations framework with China over humanity's common project to avoid climate breakdown. And it's this totally short-term perspective that you have in the US, in Britain, in capitalist economies in general, that the parts of the economy, certainly in the US, that are still growing are fossil fuels and the military-industrial complex. And so the government is just doubling down on those. And of course, the two things are related, right? If you look at the war in Ukraine, you've really got the perfect storm where you've got this massively increased demand for weaponry, including weapons that create enormous environmental destruction. And as an aside, similarly, they're also looking the other way while Israel uses white phosphorus in Gaza. And then, back to Ukraine, they're replacing Russian gas that used to turn up via Nord Stream pipeline straight into Central Europe with United States fracked liquid natural gas, which has to be cooled to 70 degrees below 0 Celsius and then shipped all the way across the Atlantic. I mean, it's obviously an environmental disaster. So you've got this convergence of economic, political, military, hegemonistic, imperialist interests that are militating against doing anything meaningful in relation to climate change. And meanwhile, they see China making the progress that it's making, and they see that engaging with China, cooperating with China, incorporating China into their global supply chains would benefit China. Okay, it will benefit everyone else as well, but they don't want to do anything that will benefit China. So they put sanctions on polysilicon, they put sanctions on Chinese solar panels and other solar materials, they put restrictions and tariffs on Chinese EVs. These are all the things that could make a green transition viable in the US, and it could make a green transition viable in Europe. But ultimately, it turns out that suppressing China's rise is more important than making that kind of progress. And I'd say that this is really the modern manifestation of the old slogan, better to be dead than red.
Exactly. Yes. I've said, in similar ways that the ruling capitalist elite would rather see the end of the planet than the end of their power and privilege. It's the same thing. But, I want to drill down a little bit more. The capitalist global West was built on fossil fuels. Western industrial capitalism arose through fossil fuels, first coal and then petroleum. And petroleum is really the catalyst of the commodity form. It drives the machinery of commodification. It fuels the transportation, the distribution. It's one of the key raw materials. And really the power of the global empire has been based on its control of oil, the subjugation of its producers, the coercion of consumers, and also the exorbitant privilege exacted through the U.S. dollar that mediates its distribution and consumption. We are a petrodollar economy. And so it routinely threatens and overthrows governments that challenge that. But what's most striking for me is, the sun, the wind, and the waves are a commons that cannot be controlled or dominated by the United States. And so when China gives countries the capacity to harness these commons, they have a way to reclaim energy sovereignty and thus start to develop their own national sovereignty and develop outside of the fossil fuel stranglehold. So, to borrow that quip, it's a way of dismantling the master's house without using the master's tools. But so this is profoundly optimistic, in my opinion. But if we look at the Western press, it seems like they're still trying to spin this, in a negative fashion. There's an article from the New York Times, and, despite the good news, they're trying to, insinuate that there is, something, bad about this. This is a coercive process. And of course, we still see the extraordinary demonization of China in around the environment, despite the fact, as you point out, that the real metric that matters is cumulative carbon emissions, not the carbon emissions over a single point in time, because carbon lasts for 1,000 years. So I guess all of this is to say, what do you think this implies for the global South? And over the longer term, what do you think will be the consequences of these extraordinary technological innovations of China?
Right. I completely agree with what you said, and I think it was a very powerful way to put it in terms of how this whole process is contributing to sovereignty, and how the air, the wind, the sun are part of our global commons, and how that impacts geopolitical dynamics. And the Ember report actually has a load of useful information on this question. So it points out that 2/3 of developing countries have been able to leapfrog the US when it comes to the share of solar power in their electricity mix. And the reason that this has been possible is pretty much exclusively down to Chinese cheap technology. China's invested and innovated at such an unbelievable scale that it's achieved these economies of scale, such that the cost of solar PV, the cost of wind power, the cost of batteries since 2010 has fallen by like 70, 80, 90%, to a point like they've driven such dramatic cost reductions that nearly everywhere in the world now, if you're building a power station, it's a better choice economically as well as in environmental terms to go for renewable energy rather than to go for fossil fuels. They've driven dramatic cost reductions in wind turbines, in solar panels, in electric vehicles. So, and the stat, the kind of headline stat on this in the Ember report is that 91% of new wind and solar facilities around the world are cheaper than their fossil fuel alternatives. China's solar exports have tripled in the last 5 years. and China's solar exports to Africa alone increased by 60% just in the last year. And so, you know, as a result of that, China's whole strategy is poised to trigger a global decline in emissions, not just in China, but around the world. Obviously, a global decline in emissions will, to some degree, be predicated on China's emissions reducing, which they are already starting to do. But also it means a global uptake of Chinese clean energy technology. And there's another quote from the report. China's investment in the electro-technology revolution is creating choices for every other country, unlocking a clean, more affordable, and secure energy future. And there was a similar point in today's Financial Times. The reporter says, while President Trump calls climate change a con, China is offering new technology and products to countries to develop green energy and to prepare for the increasingly frequent and intense storms, floods, and droughts. So, as we've said, what China's doing is a game changer, not just in China, but around the world.
Yeah. So, I think this is, as I've said before, this is really, really optimistic news. And I think it's important for us to not only, get this news out, but also to encourage, the adoption of these, actual capacities, which, as you point out, and as we well know in the United States, are extraordinarily restricted in the United States. I just want to point out one more piece, which is that China has committed to a 7 to 10% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2035. It has already peaked, and it's well on its way to significant reductions. And what we have seen in the historical record is that China underpromises and over-delivers on its on its commitments. And I think, as others have pointed out, it's really been the most determined, effective, and result-oriented country as far as dealing with greenhouse gas emissions is concerned.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And even New York Times and other bourgeois media outlets have pointed that out. A few commentators have said, well, a 7 to 10% reduction by 2035 isn't consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement and is not going to save the planet. But these news outlets have also cited other experts as pointing out that, well, China's got a very long track record precisely of under-promising and over-delivering. And they've already done that. In 2020, they announced their two big climate goals to reach peak emissions by 2030 and to get to net zero by 2060. According to all credible analysis, including by the very popular website Climate Brief, it was 2024 that they actually peaked emissions. So they got there 6 years early. They also reached their 2030 target for wind and solar capacity 5 or 6 years early. And they're well on the way towards the overall plan of reducing emissions towards the 2060 goal. And, what people maybe don't understand all the time about China is that they don't just invent goals out of thin air. And then proceed to do nothing about them, which is, I suppose, what we're used to in Britain, what we're used to in Europe, what we're used to in the United States. What China sets pretty kind of conservative goals that it absolutely knows it can meet, and then it goes all out to meet them and to exceed them. So, when China says that it will commit to a 10% reduction in emissions in the next 10 years, it's very likely that it will be a lot more than that. And furthermore, that will be a lot more impressive of emissions reduction than we'll see elsewhere in the world. So, I think people have to get used to and are getting used to the fact that China is the global leader on this. And if we want to achieve progress at a global level, if we're really serious about this goal of preventing climate breakdown, and I think we probably should be, then we need to work with China. We need to acknowledge China's leadership, and we need to pressure our governments to coordinate with China. And we mustn't let the progressive movement and the environmental movement be used as a sort of pawn in the new Cold War. We actually need to, as citizens and as political movements and as progressive people and as environmentalists, to put mass pressure on our governments to cooperate with China in the interests of humanity.
Rather than go to war.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion with you. Where can people follow your work?
So, as you mentioned, I'm co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. The website is socialistchina.org. You can sign up to our weekly newsletter there. We've got a Telegram channel, which is t.me/socialist_China. Twitter/X is also socialist_China. I've got a book called The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. That can be found at all good booksellers, but which probably doesn't include Amazon.
But highly recommended. I highly recommend Carlos's book, The East is Still Red. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Thanks, KJ.
And for a change of scenery, we are going to show you a clip of Tao Tao Emma, also known as Tao Mingzi, a Chinese influencer who promotes horse riding and ancient falconry. Traditional eagle hunting is considered one of the oldest forms of falconry and is considered an intangible cultural asset practiced by the nomadic Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Mongolian ethnic minorities in North and Northwest China.
Whoa.